Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer said when he reviewed her charts at 11:38 p.m., his voice carrying across the St. Michael's ER in Denver like he was addressing a lecture hall instead of one quiet woman checking 4 lines. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. She inserted a 20-gauge angiocath into a diabetic patient's wrist with hands steady as surgical lasers while his words hung in the fluorescent-lit air like smoke. He had no idea what she was. And he had no idea what was walking through those doors in exactly 47 minutes. The trembling in her left hand stopped the moment she touched the patient. It always did. Brooke Sullivan moved through the night shift like water finding its path, efficient, present, utterly unremarkable. Her scrubs were the same pale blue as every other nurse on the floor. Her ID badge clipped to her pocket showed a 5-year-old photograph, blonde hair pulled back, eyes that gave nothing away. The file under previous experience listed only County General in Colorado Springs and a 6-month gap she'd explained away as personal leave. No one asked questions. No one ever did when you were quiet enough, forgettable enough, competent enough to stay invisible. She adjusted the bed rails for her patient in bed 3, an elderly woman with acute pancreatitis whose pain medication she'd timed perfectly, 68 minutes between doses, never early, always documented. The ventilator in bed 5 wheezed its mechanical rhythm like a sleeping animal, and Brooke checked the tube positioning without the anxious hovering that younger nurses did. The endotracheal tube was exactly where it belonged. Everything was exactly where it belonged. That was the only way to survive with people like Mercer watching. Her thermos of coffee sat cold on the medication cart. She'd filled it at 10:15 p.m. and forgotten about it entirely. The coffee was always cold. The forgetting was deliberate, a small thing that made her seem more human, more scattered, less like someone who remembered every detail of every shift, every supply order, every discrepancy in the billing record she'd photographed with her phone while restocking the crash cart at 2 a.m. last Tuesday. The supply orders didn't match the hospital's official documentation. Syringes, morphine vials, saline bags, quantities running 15 to 23% higher than the daily patient census could possibly justify. The phantom orders always went to Medicare, always billed under emergency protocols, always approved by Dr. Mercer's digital signature. Someone at Walter Reed would care about that. They cared about a lot of things. That was why she was here. That was why Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen was in bed 7. He'd arrived at 9:34 p.m. via ambulance from the VA hospital, transferred for specialized wound management related to the shrapnel injury he'd sustained in Baghdad 3 months ago. The intake notes were clinical and sparse. The man in the bed was anything but. His presence made the air pressure change, the way someone carries themselves when they've been trained to move through hostile space, even unconscious, even medicated with 8 milligrams of morphine every 4 hours. His dark eyes tracked her when she entered the room, recognition flickering across his face like a faulty electrical connection before the drugs pulled him back under. She didn't meet those eyes. She couldn't afford recognition. She adjusted his foredrip with one hand and marked the bag's expiration time with the other, her movements economical and practiced. The medic from 3rd Special Forces Group, the one who'd taken her position when she rotated into her actual assignment, was supposed to be stable. He was supposed to be a straightforward recovery. He wasn't supposed to be looking at her like he'd seen a ghost, and she definitely wasn't supposed to feel the weight of knowing exactly how many operations he'd conducted in that same FOB medical tent outside Fallujah, how many IED casualties he'd triaged, how many soldiers had lived because he'd kept his hand steady when the world was ending. 3 tours. 22 months total. He'd filled that slot perfectly. His pain management is adequate, Brooke said quietly, speaking to the night shift resident, a young man named Patterson who'd never heard her voice rise above a conversational volume. Monitor his drain output. Call me if the serous fluid turns serosanguineous. I'll check him again at 1 a.m. Patterson nodded, already making notes. Nobody questioned her clinical assessments. That was the benefit of never being wrong, of documenting everything perfectly, of knowing the protocols better than the doctors who'd gone to medical school instead of combat medicine training. She left bed 7 without looking back. The medication cart needed restocking. The 4 pumps in bays 2 and 4 needed new tubing. The monitor leads in the trauma bay were leaving false readings. She'd noticed it 3 shifts ago and filed a maintenance request that Dr. Mercer had apparently decided wasn't urgent. She'd file another one. Mercer liked to slow things down, to create small bottlenecks that made the nursing staff look inefficient. He was building something. A paper trail. A case for why St. Michael's didn't need floor nurses who asked questions about supply inventories or noticed when expensive medications didn't match patient counts. He definitely didn't need nurses who'd started requesting the detailed billing records for Medicare claims. She'd submitted that request through proper channels 16 days ago. It was still pending. Mercer was the department director. Pending could last forever if he wanted it to. But that wasn't her problem to solve. That wasn't why Walter Reed had placed her here. The security camera in the northwest corner of the medication room had a blind spot precisely 4.7 feet from the cabinet where Mercer stored his personal tablet. She'd measured it. She'd tested it twice, photographing the supply manifests at 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday and again at 3:36 a.m. on a Thursday. The Pentagon's digital forensics team could reconstruct everything from those photographs. Her job was just to document the pattern and wait for Marcus Chen to be cleared for discharge. Her job was to stay invisible until extraction protocols were activated. Her job was to not flinch when Mercer looked at her like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound like electrical current threatening to jump. Brooke replaced the tubing in Bay 2 and moved on to Bay 4, her movements precise and unhurried. A fresh-faced intern named Torres watched her work with the kind of open admiration that younger medical professionals sometimes showed toward nurses who clearly knew what they were doing. "How long have you been at St. Michael's?" Torres asked. 5 years, 2 months, Brooke said, not looking up from the 4 pump. The specific number just slipped out, the kind of detail a detail-oriented person would track. Before that, County General for 6 months. You thinking about management? Night shift supervisor position is opening up. No, Brooke said. She'd never want anything that would raise her profile, that would put her in administrative systems, that would create a paper trail about who she was becoming instead of who she'd been. I prefer direct patient care. It was the most she'd said to anyone in 3 days. But then the call came through on the hospital intercom, and everything tilted. The dispatcher's voice was tight, the particular tight that came from adrenaline and threat assessment, code gray. ER entrance. All available security. Code gray, ER entrance. Code gray meant violence. Code gray meant danger. Brooke's hands didn't pause. She finished securing the 4 tubing and stepped out into the main corridor just as the noise started, not shouting yet, but the precursor to it, the sound of something large and furious and not entirely sane beginning to recognize where it was. Torres had already moved toward the stairwell. The unit clerk was pushing the nursing station desk away from her body, creating distance. Smart. Good threat assessment. She could respect that. But Brooke walked forward. She moved through the corridor with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. Baghdad. The FOB at Phi Base Combat Outpost Malibu in 2007, when a mortar round had taken out the northeastern supply tent and she'd triaged casualties in the kind of darkness that erases everything except the sound of people bleeding. Fallujah. Sanjin Valley in Helmand Province when her medical team had been caught between 2 separate ambush zones and she performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife because that was what the patient needed and there was no time for hesitation. This was going to be easier than any of that. The ER entrance doors burst open with the force of a body hitting them at full speed. He was 6'5", maybe 6'6", his arms corded with muscle that had come from pharmaceuticals and rage in equal measure. Blood spattered his shirt, not his own, probably, not from the wild way he was moving. His eyes had the dilated pupils and manic awareness of someone mid-psychotic break, and the tire iron in his right hand was raised like he was already swinging it, like the world had done him some fundamental wrong that deserved to be corrected through violence. The triage desk computer exploded when he hit it, sparks, plastic fragments, the sound of expensive equipment dying in a shower of circuitry. The waiting room cleared in seconds. He was screaming something about voices, about conspiracies, about people in the walls. His grip on the tire iron tightened, adjusted, aimed for the next thing that would shatter. But Brooke was already moving. She walked toward him with her hands visible and empty, her voice dropping into the low, firm cadence she'd used to talk down fighters at checkpoints outside Fallujah, men who were scared, injured, convinced that the American medic was the enemy. Her voice cut through his psychotic break like she was simply giving medication directions, like the tire iron wasn't a lethal weapon and this man wasn't a threat to everyone in a 20-foot radius. "I need you to breathe," she said, no louder than conversation. "Just breathe. Let's sit down." He swung at her. The tire iron moved through the space her head had occupied 2 seconds prior because she'd already shifted her weight, her body reading his intention from the angle of his shoulders and the breath he took before the swing. Her hands moved without conscious thought, years of training collapsing into muscle memory and precision. The tire iron fell to the tile floor with a sound like a bell striking once. And he sat down. 90 seconds. It took 90 seconds to move from Code Grey to a man sitting on the vinyl floor of St. Michael's ER, his psychotic break interrupted, his breathing beginning to regulate, his hands, now calm, resting on his knees. Brooke remained at a distance of exactly 3 feet, her posture non-threatening but prepared, her eyes tracking his hands and his respiratory rate and the subtle shift in his pupils that meant the acute phase was beginning to pass. "Someone's coming to help you," she said quietly. "Medical help. They're good at what they do. You're safe now." Behind the nursing station, Dr. Mercer had screamed something about getting back, about her being a stupid woman, about calling security. Security was already running toward her, toward him, toward the situation she'd just diffused in the time it took most people to process that danger was real. But Brooke had already turned away. She walked back toward bed 7 like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just neutralized a Code Grey, like the tremor in her left hand wasn't back now that the adrenaline was fading. Her phone sat cold and silent in her pocket. No messages from Walter Reed. No extraction orders. No indication that her assignment was anything other than exactly what it appeared to be, a nurse staying invisible while watching a Special Forces medic recover from injuries sustained in Baghdad and documenting financial irregularities that would eventually matter to someone with the authority to do something about them. But then something happened that she hadn't anticipated. The monitors in bed 7 started alarming. Brooke heard it before she entered the room, that particular sound of a heart rate doing things it shouldn't, of oxygen saturation beginning to drop, of the kind of medical emergency that arrived without warning and with the kind of urgency that didn't allow for hesitation. She moved from the corridor to his bedside in full long strides, her hands already assessing what her eyes could confirm Marcus was seizing. Not the small tremors of post-traumatic stress. A full grand mal seizure, his body rigid and convulsing, his airway at risk. And that was when Brooke Sullivan stopped being invisible. The Grand Rounds conference room at St. Michael's smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant, the kind of chemical blend that clung to the back of your throat after 8 hours. 12 residents sat in rigid rows of chairs, their notebook spines catching the fluorescent light like dominoes waiting to fall. 4 attending physicians occupied the back wall, arms crossed, faces neutral. Dr. Mercer stood at the head of the table with the projector remote in his right hand, his left hand buried in his coat pocket, a gesture that somehow conveyed both authority and contempt simultaneously. "Let's discuss inadequate documentation practices," he announced, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man who'd perfected the art of public humiliation into something resembling instruction. The laser pointer blinked on. "Nurse Sullivan here has provided us with a textbook example of what happens when county general standards meet a real hospital." Brooke stood against the back wall where he'd positioned her, the way a trainer might position a dog that hadn't learned to sit. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. Her jaw muscles worked silently, the kind of tension that lives in the space between breathing and screaming. Her eyes fixed on the middle distance, the wall clock, the exit sign, anywhere but his face. To move would be to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. To react was to lose. She'd learned this at 23 years old in a forward operating base outside Fallujah, where showing anger to men with power meant losing access to supplies that kept soldiers breathing. Note the lack of specificity here. Mercer circled a section of her chart with the laser pointer, the red dot moving across entries that documented every medication, every vital sign change, every assessment with the precision of someone who'd written hospital protocols. Vague timestamps there. This is how malpractice suits begin, people. This is how we end up in depositions. He let the pointer linger on her name at the top of the page. Inadequate. Dangerous. Borderline negligent. A resident in the front row shifted in his chair, the plastic creaking loud in the sudden silence. No one else moved. No one looked at her. The air pressure changed in the room the way it does before a storm, that heavy, waiting quality where electricity builds beneath the skin. Brooke didn't correct him. Her notes were flawless. She had documented every detail with the same obsessive precision she'd once used filling after-action reports for command. But correcting him would be a challenge to his authority, and challenging authority in front of subordinates was the kind of thing that got you reassigned to night shifts, or suspended on fabricated charges, or worse. She'd seen it happen. She knew how men like Mercer operated. They built paper trails methodically, layer upon layer, until they could dismiss you and you had no recourse because the documentation said otherwise. So she stood perfectly still while he dismantled her reputation in front of people who didn't know her name 6 months ago and wouldn't remember her face 6 months from now. An hour later, at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, Brooke slid a dollar bill into the slot with hands that remained perfectly steady. The machine hummed its mechanical rhythm. The dollar bill disappeared into the mechanism, crisp and controlled. She pressed the button for black coffee, nothing else, no sugar, no cream, just the thing itself. Rubber gloves snapped somewhere down the hallway. A monitor beeped 3 times and fell silent. The world continued its work as if the conference room hadn't just happened. 2 residents rounded the corner from the stairwell, still laughing about something, their conversation colliding into the sound of her own breathing. They froze slightly when they saw her, that awkward moment where people realize they're standing in the presence of the thing they were just discussing. The younger one, maybe 28, pale skin and the kind of tired eyes that come from 70-hour weeks, didn't quite meet her gaze. Dr. Mercer appeared behind them like a shadow with a voice. His footsteps were deliberate, loud, the kind of walking a man does when he wants to be noticed. "Some nurses," he said, not quite looking at her but letting the observation hang in the air where everyone could hear it, "think a few years at County General makes them trauma experts. I've seen medical students with better assessment skills." He paused, letting the word settle. "Better judgment, certainly. Better bedside manner." The resident snickered, nervous sounds, the kind of laughter that says they knew this was theater and they were extras in a performance none of them had consented to. Mercer walked past without looking back, satisfied with the impact. Brooke's hand didn't shake as she pressed the button for her coffee. The can dropped into the retrieval slot with a metallic clang. She bent, retrieved it, and straightened. The aluminum was cold against her palm. She walked away from the vending machine with the same neutral pace she'd entered it, and no one in the hallway followed her with their eyes. She'd become the kind of invisible that comes from being too well trained at staying still while the world moved around her. That afternoon, she returned from her legally mandated 30-minute break to find Dr. Mercer standing at the bedside of Marcus Chen in bed 7. A security guard stood 6 feet away, his hand resting on his belt, his body language suggesting this was a serious matter. Mercer was holding a clipboard. His expression was the mask of professional concern, the kind of face that looks sympathetic but means execution. "These pre-filled morphine syringes," Mercer said, not waiting for her to acknowledge the scene before him, "were left unattended during your absence." He was pointing to the medication cart, the locked cart where protocol demanded controlled substances be stored, the cart she had secured personally before stepping away for 15 minutes to eat something that might have been a sandwich. The syringes sat exactly where they were supposed to sit. She'd logged them exactly how the system required. The documentation would be impeccable. "That's a controlled substance violation," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of regulation, of institutional power, of systems designed to protect institutions rather than patients. "1. We're required to report. Sign here, acknowledging the incident report. You're suspended pending investigation." She took the pen from his extended hand. The clipboard felt light in her other hand, the weight of a few pieces of paper, though the gravity of what those papers meant pressed down like a physical force. Her signature, when she applied it, emerged in perfect penmanship. Each letter crisp and deliberate. Not shaking. Not faltering. Not showing the smallest indication that her world had just compressed into something very small and very dark. Marcus Chen's eyes flickered open as she finished signing. The morphine made him slow, his pupils dilated, his awareness pulling through layers of pharmaceutical fog like someone surfacing from deep water. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, maybe less, his gaze focused on her face. Recognition moved across his expression, something that said he knew her from somewhere, from some context other than this hospital room, from some life that existed before the shrapnel and the medical evacuation and the cover story about a training accident. She couldn't acknowledge it. She couldn't meet his eyes and hold them. She couldn't do anything that would suggest to Mercer, who was still watching from the doorway, that she and the patient in bed 7 had any connection beyond her nursing responsibilities. She returned the clipboard to Mercer. She returned to Marcus's bedside and adjusted his full line with the kind of professional precision that said nothing about the tremor that had started in her hands. The tremor wasn't fear. The tremor was something else, the accumulated weight of maintaining composure under pressure, of moving through rooms where men with institutional power were building cases against her, of watching someone she'd served with, someone whose unit had replaced her when she left for this assignment, lying unconscious and at risk while she was being systematically removed from access to him. Her hands trembled slightly when she touched the four-port, and for the first time since the conference room, something cracked in the professional mask she'd worn like armor. Mercer watched from the doorway, satisfied. He'd pushed her hard enough to break something, to create the opening he needed. The trembling hands. The moment of weakness. He didn't understand what he was looking at. He saw vulnerability where there was only exhaustion, saw defeat where there was only the sound of a warrior learning to move through a battlefield wearing scrubs instead of tactical gear. He turned and walked away, already planning the next move, already confident in the trajectory of her dismissal. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:08 a.m., when the ER doors exploded inward with a sound like a bomb going off in a confined space, and everything changed in the seconds it takes for a man with a tire iron and no reality in his eyes to become the only thing in the world that mattered. The man hit the doors like shrapnel through a checkpoint. 6'5", blood down his shirt, screaming words that weren't words, just noise shaped like rage. The tire iron came up. The triage computer exploded in a shower of sparks and plastic, glass spinning through fluorescent light like diamonds made of violence. 3 nurses scattered. 1 orderly didn't make it 5 steps before the attacker pivoted toward the stairwell, his free hand clawing at air like he was fighting something only he could see. The remaining staff reversed course, feet sliding on polished tile, bodies colliding as they funneled toward the safety of the back hallway. Someone screamed. Someone else was already calling security on the radio, voice high and fractured, the kind of panic that turns words into fragments. Dr. Mercer stood frozen behind the nurse's station, his face drained of color. "Get back, you stupid woman," he shouted as Brooke stepped forward. "Get back, call security, call." She didn't stop walking. The man swung the tire iron in a wide arc, testing the space, his eyes wide with the particular terror of someone whose brain was no longer his own. Meth. 6 days awake. The kind of psychosis that doesn't negotiate. He breathed like an animal caught in a cage too small for its body, chest heaving, pupils dilated to the size of dimes, sweat streaming off his shaved head in rivers. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song above them, indifferent to what was about to happen. Brooke's hands were empty. Visible. She kept her palms forward at chest level as she closed the distance, her feet moving with the measured pace she'd learned outside Fallujah, at checkpoints where a wrong step meant bullets and men screaming Arabic and English all at once. Her voice dropped into the register she'd used there, low enough to cut through noise, firm enough that it carried authority without aggression. "I'm medical," she said. Not a shout. The opposite of a shout. A voice like concrete poured steady. "You're safe now." "I'm Brooke." "What's your name?" The man wheeled toward her. The tire iron whistled through the air, a sound like wind through a broken window, and she sidestepped with the precision of someone who had spent 3,000 hours practicing exactly this. Not running. Not freezing. Moving. His momentum carried the weapon past her shoulder close enough that she felt the compression in the air, the heat of his exertion, the copper smell of blood and sweat and something chemical underneath, the reek of crystal meth burning through a body from the inside. She didn't flinch. She didn't breathe differently. She stepped in closer. "I need you to listen to my voice," Brooke continued, her tone exactly the cadence she used when drawing up medications. Calm. Instructional. The voice of someone who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. "You're experiencing a medical emergency. Not a criminal emergency. Medical. That means I can help you. The voices you're hearing, that's your brain chemistry. Completely reversible. You understand me?" The attacker's breath came in ragged heaves. His pupils tracked her movement, but something in his expression shifted, the wild animal fear finding a single point of focus. He raised the tire iron again, but the motion was slower now, less explosive. Questioning. Like a man waking from a nightmare who wasn't quite sure which world he inhabited. Brooke took another step. "What's your name?" she asked again. "Michael." The walls, there," his voice cracked like old concrete. "Michael, my name is Brooke. I'm going to touch your arm now. That's okay?" She didn't wait for permission. She never did. Her hands moved toward him, thumbs finding the pressure points on his wrists with a kind of spatial awareness that comes from field medicine, from triage tents and men dying in her hands and learning where human bodies had their off switches. The radial nerve. The median nerve. The places where pain could be information instead of suffering. Her thumbs pressed. Not crushing. Just precise. Just enough. Michael's grip failed. The tire iron hit the floor with a clang that echoed through the ER like a bell announcing the end of something. His knees buckled. "Sit down right here," Brooke said, guiding his body toward the floor with one hand on his shoulder, the other maintaining pressure on his wrist, not painful, not now, just controlling. "That's good. You're doing good. Keep breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Tell me what you took tonight." "I'm not police. I'm medical." "What did you take?" The man sank onto the tile, his massive frame reducing to something smaller, something broken. Words tumbled out, incomprehensible at first, then clarifying. Meth. Fentanyl. Something he'd found on the street that had a name he couldn't remember. 6 days without sleep. His brother was dead. The walls kept whispering about it. He couldn't make the voices stop, and so he ran and the voices followed, and he was going to die right here on this floor unless someone stopped him. Brooke knelt beside him, maintaining eye contact, her voice a steady monotone that delivered medical information the way a surgeon delivers stitches. "Your body is experiencing acute amphetamine psychosis with possible fentanyl toxicity. We can treat this. Benzodiazepines will stop the hallucinations. For fluids will stabilize your core temperature. You're going to be okay. But I need you to keep breathing and stay seated. Do you understand?" Security arrived 90 seconds after she disarmed him. 2 uniformed officers who had expected a fight. Instead, they found a 6'5" man sitting on the floor with his hands in his lap, a small nurse kneeling beside him checking his pupil response with the kind of casual competence that suggested she disarmed violent patients between coffee breaks. One of the officers actually laughed, a short, shocked sound. "How did you?" But Brooke wasn't listening anymore. The stunned residents were emerging from the stairwell now, their faces a study in confusion and something that might have been shame. They had scattered. They had run. And the small, unremarkable woman in the purple scrubs had walked straight into the violence and made it stop like she was rearranging furniture. Then Marcus Chen's monitor began alarming. The sound cut through everything, that particular high-pitched wail of a patient in distress, the sound that made every head in the ER turn simultaneously. Brooke's body moved before her conscious mind caught up. She was on her feet moving toward bed 7 as the overnight physician fumbled with the chart, his hands shaking slightly. The man was too new. Too junior. Too far out of his depth. Brooke could see it from 10 feet away. Marcus was cyanotic, that terrible blue-purple tint that came when oxygen couldn't find its way into the bloodstream. His chest heaved in shallow, desperate breaths. His left calf was visibly swollen, the skin stretched tight and pale underneath the hospital gown. The timeline hit her instantly, 3 weeks immobile, just beginning to mobilize again, the deep vein thrombosis probably forming in the first week and releasing its payload into his pulmonary arteries right now, right this moment, like a time bomb that had finally run down. His oxygen saturation just dropped to 82, the physician said. His voice was high. Panicked. What do I? Pulmonary embolism, Brooke said. Look at the swelling in his left calf. He's been immobile for. I didn't ask for your assessment, Nurse Sullivan, the physician snapped. His face flushed with the particular rage of a man defending his territory, his competence, his right to be in charge. Step back. Marcus stopped breathing. The monitor flatlined. Alarms erupted like artillery, the code blue announcement, the crash cart being wheeled, nurses responding with that controlled chaos of a hospital in crisis. The physician reached for the defibrillator pads with trembling hands. Wrong. So completely wrong. Marcus didn't need electricity to shock his heart. He needed oxygen. He needed blood flow. He needed someone to crack his chest and reach in and bring him back manually, with hands and muscle memory and the kind of experience that only came from doing it when it mattered most. Brooke looked at the physician. Looked at Marcus turning darker blue by the second. Looked at the crash cart sitting 6 feet away with its scalpels and retractors and the tools of resurrection. She could feel Mercer's eyes on her from across the ER, that weight of power, the knowledge that she was suspended, that this wasn't her patient, that if she touched him now she was violating his explicit order and throwing away whatever remained of her cover. Marcus had been her medic once. In Baghdad. In the dust and the heat and the day when her entire squad had been pinned in a market and he dragged her to cover and applied a tourniquet to her leg that had kept her alive long enough to call the medevac. He had taken her position with the 3rd Special Forces Group. He had caught shrapnel 3 months ago in the same streets where she'd carried him out. She reached for the scalpel anyway. 10 minutes after the man with the tire iron sits breathing into a paper bag with Brooke's hand steady on his shoulder, the monitors in bed 7 start screaming. Marcus Chen's oxygen saturation plummets like a stone dropped from a building. 88. 79. 65. The overnight physician, a resident named Torres who'd been half asleep at the coffee station during the entire tire iron incident, turns toward the sound with the slow confusion of someone waking from a dream. Brooke is already moving. She doesn't think about the reassignment letter sitting in Mercer's locked office. Doesn't think about the suspension pending investigation, the fabricated medication violations, the way her hands had trembled when she signed that incident report. Muscle memory takes over. Her hands move before her conscious thought completes. She's opening the crash cart beside Marcus's bed. Pulling the scalpel from its sterile wrapper with the controlled precision of someone who has done this in conditions far worse than a well-lit emergency room. The blade catches the fluorescent light like a small silver prayer. Around her, residents freeze. Torres stops mid-stride, his mouth opening to form words that don't come. No one stops her. No one asks what she's doing. The command voice that emerges from her throat isn't a request. It's a tone that men under fire have learned to obey without question. Someone bag him. Now. A nurse moves without thinking, positioning the bag valve mask over Marcus's nose and mouth, squeezing rhythmic breaths into his lungs. Brooke's non-dominant hand finds the landmarks on his chest with the certainty of someone who has counted ribs by feel in darkness, in rain, in the screaming aftermath of explosions. 5th intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The scalpel moves. 1 incision. Fast. Brutal. Effective. Not a surgical incision. A field incision. The kind you make when there's no time for sterile technique, when the patient dies in the next 60 seconds if you don't act. The muscle memory of tent surgeries under mortar fire guides her hands through movements no civilian nurse should know. Her fingers spread the ribs, rough, deliberate, causing fractures she'll feel snap under her palms. The pericardium membrane tears away beneath her exploring fingertips. And there. Marcus's heart. Pale and barely moving. Stopped almost entirely. 15 seconds since the first incision. Torres finally finds his voice. "What are you?" But Brooke is already beginning direct cardiac massage. Her bare hands on Marcus's heart. Compressions that would crush tissue in a normal human being but are exactly what a man in cardiac arrest requires. 1, 2, 3. Her thumb pressing the left ventricle against the sternum. Her fingers cradling the right atrium like they're holding the thing that matters most in the world. Because they are. 30 seconds. The residents stand frozen watching a nurse perform a procedure that requires a trauma surgeon with 15 years of experience. 45 seconds. The heart quivers beneath her fingers. 1 beat. Irregular. Another. Marcus's chest rises on its own. She removes her hands. Steps back. Lets Torres take over with shaking hands, though his hands have no business being this steady after watching what he just witnessed. The room is silent except for the percussion of monitors. No one speaks. The ventilator hisses. The 4 pumps click with mechanical precision. Someone's shoes squeak on the tile. Brooke walks to the sink and washes blood off her arms with methodical precision, the soap foam turning pale pink as it swirls down the drain. Her face shows nothing. Her jaw is a straight line. Her shoulders drop exactly 1 inch back into the posture of a nurse instead of the posture of a surgeon. The transformation is so fluid, so complete, that if you weren't watching closely you'd miss it. But the residents are watching. They're watching like she's a ghost that just materialized in their ER. By sunrise, the security footage of both events, the tire iron disarmament with the perfect pressure point release that every martial arts instructor in the city would recognize, and the field thoracotomy that every trauma surgeon in Denver would analyze on conference calls, sits on Dr. Mercer's desk. The overnight administrator delivers it personally. Mercer watches both clips 3 times. 4 times. His fingers drum against the keyboard. Then he makes 2 phone calls. The first is to HR. The second is to security. His voice is quiet and controlled and far more dangerous than when he'd been shouting. At 6 a.m., as Brooke finishes her shift notes in the cramped nurse's station, Dr. Mercer arrives with a security escort and a printed reassignment order. The paper is already signed by the administrator. The date reads an hour ago. Mercer's smile is thin as a surgical blade. Effective immediately, you're transferred to parking garage overnight shift, he says. His eyes are 2 chips of ice. No patient contact. You'll monitor security cameras and log vehicle entries. 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Every night. Starting tonight. He places the order in front of her with 1 finger keeping it pinned to the desk. Your creative heroics may impress some people, but this is a hospital, not a battlefield. The ER requires discipline. Structure. You're done seeing patients here. She signs the transfer acknowledgement without reading it. Her signature is identical to the last signature on the previous form. Perfect penmanship. Steady hand. The only evidence of her response is the slight pause before she sets the pen down. She can't protest without explaining why a simple ER nurse has combat medical instincts. Can't reveal that Walter Reed placed her at St. Michael's specifically to monitor Marcus for extraction once he was stable, that her assignment has an expiration date measured in weeks, not years. Can't break cover even as she cleans out her locker, the water bottle with the faded unit patch, the compression socks, the small framed photo of Ramirez with his arm around her shoulder, both of them smiling like they believed they'd make it home. And beneath it all, the folded flag with Ramirez's name stitched in letters so small only someone looking for it would see them. That flag has lived in her locker for 1,847 days. She picks it up and holds it against her chest for exactly 3 seconds. Then she tucks it into her bag. She drives home at 6:38 a.m. still wearing her scrubs, the fabric sticking to her skin like a second skin that doesn't fit anymore. The morning light in Denver hits the city like a judgment. Every street is too bright. Every corner seems designed to show her exactly what she's lost. The apartment is empty. Has been empty for years except for this one assignment. She sits at the kitchen table in the dark, still wearing the scrubs, the flag folded on the table in front of her. That's where her 14-year-old son finds her at 3 p.m., the keys rattling as he comes through the door from school. He stops in the kitchen doorway. His mother is sitting in the dark. Her scrubs are still on. She's been in the same position for 8 hours except for the time she got up to stand at the window. There are tracks on her cheeks that he recognizes from overseas video calls with his grandmother, the kind of tears that come from somewhere too deep to explain. "Mom," he says carefully, "the way you'd approach an injured animal, are you okay?" She doesn't answer immediately. When she does, her voice is so quiet he has to step closer to hear it. "The shift doesn't end until 7, she says finally. "I'm home early." He sits down across from her at the table. They don't speak. After a while, he reaches across and puts his hand on top of hers. His hand is almost as large as hers now. When did that happen? When did her son become a young man while she was overseas, while she was supposed to be watching someone else's life fall apart? "Mom," he says, and this time it's not a question, "What are you going to do?" But that's the question she can't answer. Because doing nothing means Mercer wins. Doing something means blowing her cover wide open. And underneath it all, somewhere beneath the composure and the training and the ability to hold her hand steady while cutting into a man's chest, there's a 14-year-old kid who just watched his mother come home at 6:06 in the morning with blood she'd washed off but not quite completely, something still dark beneath her fingernails that no amount of hospital soap could remove. There's a woman who joined the army at 22 to matter, to help, to make a difference, and watched that calling get systematically dismantled by a man who cared more about his billing practices than about healing. There's Captain Brooke Sullivan, code name Valkyrie, sitting in her kitchen in the pre-dawn light with her son's hand on hers and absolutely nowhere left to go. Her son appeared in the ER waiting room at 7:15 in the morning carrying a shadow box under his arm like a torch, walking past the security desk without slowing, his 14-year-old frame moving with the same measured purpose his mother carried into dangerous rooms. Nobody stopped him. The night shift nurses were changing over, the administrator hadn't arrived yet, and the shadow box looked official enough that staff assumed it belonged there. He walked straight toward the crowd gathering outside Marcus's room, where the DoD medical alert code had triggered its response protocol at dawn, a Marine colonel in dress blue standing at the foot of the bed, a Pentagon liaison with a leather folder, and 2 officers in digital camouflage checking credentials at the door like they were guarding classified material. The boy pushed through. "Mom, they need to see these." The room went dead silent. Marcus Chen's eyes flickered open, and his lips moved without sound at first, then one word scraped out like gravel, "Valkyrie." The call sign hung in the air like a frequency only certain people could hear. The Marine colonel turned, eyebrows rising, and the liaison's hand went instinctively to his folder. The boy opened the shadow box. Inside, mounted on burgundy felt with the precision of a museum display, lay a combat medical badge. Below it, a bronze star with Valor ribbon. Below that, citations and commendations dating back 18 years, each one signed, each one indexed, each one proof of a life that didn't match the scrub-wearing nurse who'd been pushing supply carts for the past month. "Captain Brooke Sullivan," the Marine colonel said, "not a question, a recognition." His voice carried the weight of someone reading official records aloud. Extraordinary heroism under fire during Operation Steel Curtain, Fallujah, Al-Anbar province, where you performed 17 life-saving surgical procedures under sustained enemy contact, including 3 field thoracotomies conducted in active fire zones, treating personnel from 3 separate commands, with 0 surgical mortality in a combat setting where baseline survival rates were 23%. He paused. His jaw tightened. You made the difference between a medical evacuation and a coffin. 17 times. The liaison opened his folder. His lips moved, reading something that made his eyes narrow. Dr. Mercer pushed through the crowd at that moment, his presence like a man walking into his own courtroom, expecting authority, finding the ground already collapsed beneath him. His mouth opened to object to the unauthorized visitors, to demand that these military personnel follow protocol, to establish himself as the attending physician responsible for this patient, and in the 3 seconds before he could form words, a 2-star general in dress uniform stepped forward. The general rendered a slow salute, fist to chest, a gesture that meant respect, recognition, the kind of salute officers receive when they've been forged in the actual fire that most people only read about in reports. His eyes never left the shadow box. The combat medical badge caught the fluorescent light like a small sun. Mercer's mouth closed. His face drained of color. For the first time in 37 years of medical practice, he understood what it meant to stand in a room and suddenly become invisible. The liaison spoke into his phone. Confirm Captain Sullivan's status in the room. Sir, yes. Understood. He lowered the phone and addressed the hospital administrator who'd just arrived, still carrying his coffee. Director, I'm Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Defense Intelligence Agency. Captain Sullivan's placement at St. Michael's was an active classified operation. Her discharge from duty yesterday without proper notification or legal counsel has created significant complications. We'll be addressing that with your legal department. The administrator's coffee froze halfway to his lips. Captain Sullivan, the colonel continued, your commission remains active. Your clearance remains valid. Your service record speaks for itself. He turned to Mercer. And I assume the hospital is aware that disciplinary action against an active duty military officer serving in an undercover capacity is, at minimum, a federal compliance violation. Hayes pulled a document from his folder. The Pentagon will be filing a formal complaint with the Joint Commission and the Colorado Board of Medicine regarding the creation of false disciplinary records against an officer conducting authorized intelligence operations. Mercer's hands opened and closed at his sides. He looked like a man searching for a parachute cord that had already been pulled. The phone call came that afternoon. Mercer was in his office, sitting in the leather chair his wife had given him 15 years ago, staring at the framed diploma from Johns Hopkins, when his line rang. The caller ID read Dr. Harrison Weir, Johns Hopkins Medical Center. Mercer answered on the first ring. Harrison, I'm glad you called. There's been a situation here that I think you should understand. I saw the security footage on CNN. Weir's voice arrived like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, cold, removing everything unnecessary. A nurse performing a field thoracotomy while you hid behind a desk. A decorated combat surgeon working under your authority while you fabricated disciplinary complaints. You are not the physician I trained, Robert. You are not the man I thought I knew. Silence. Just breathing. I'm formally withdrawing my recommendation for your board certification, Weir continued. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I've already contacted the credentialing committee. Whatever happens next, it happens without my name attached to yours. Don't call again. The line went dead. By evening, the hospital board had convened. By midnight, Mercer's privileges were suspended pending investigation. By the following morning, the Colorado Board of Medicine had launched a state review of his medical license. The attending physicians who'd laughed at his vending machine jokes now claimed they'd always suspected something was wrong. The residents who'd nodded along during grand rounds were suddenly unavailable for interviews. His attorney explained Medicare fraud carried federal charges. His wife's attorney explained that the papers were already filed. The walls closed inward with the kind of methodical precision he'd once used to destroy Brooke's career, each brick carefully placed, each strategy anticipated, each escape route already sealed. Gravity, finally, had found him. 6 months later, a truck moved through Denver's morning traffic on the highway toward the airport. Brooke Sullivan sat in the passenger seat, her shoulder against the window, watching the city slide past like a memory she was leaving behind. Marcus Chen's hands gripped the steering wheel with the confidence of a man who'd learned to trust his body again. They wore civilian clothes, jeans, simple shirts, the kind of clothing that meant they were going somewhere official. They drove past a medical supply warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial district. A familiar figure moved in the loading bay, carrying cardboard boxes from a white van into the warehouse. Dr. Robert Mercer, stripped of his medical license, suspended pending federal prosecution, now worked inventory for a surgical distributor, counting bedpans, checking packing slips, the man who commanded an ER reduced to logistics. His hair had gone grayer. His back had bent. He didn't look up as they passed. "Do you feel bad for him?" Marcus asked. Brooke's hand moved to her jacket pocket, where the folded flag sat against her ribs, burgundy fabric, Ramirez's name embroidered on the corner in white thread, the medic who'd died in her arms in Baghdad 3 months after Marcus took his position, the reason she'd accepted Walter Reed's call and taken this mission when the Pentagon asked. She could feel the fabric through the cotton, worn soft from 16 months of carrying it through every shift. "I feel bad for every patient who trusted him," she said. "I feel bad for the nurses he humiliated who didn't have medals to prove their worth. I feel bad for my son, who learned his mother's real job from strangers." She watched the warehouse shrink in the mirror. "But I don't feel bad that consequences found him. That's not cruelty. That's just gravity." Marcus adjusted his grip, the hand that still ached from the field thoracotomy, the hand that worked because she'd cut him open on an ER floor when physics and medicine collided. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "Ramirez used to say you were the best combat surgeon he'd ever seen," Marcus said. "He told me that 3 days before the IED." Brooke nodded, her eyes tracking the city's edge coming into view. "He was wrong. The best surgeons are the ones who know when to put down the scalpel and walk away." She paused. "I'm still learning that part." They merged onto the airport exit. Behind them, Mercer loaded another box into the van. Ahead, Walter Reed waited with new soldiers who would need what only Valkyrie could teach, the ones who'd seen the worst and survived it, who carried pieces of their missions in their bones, who needed someone who understood that healing isn't about making the pain disappear. It's about making the pain mean something. The flag remained in her pocket. The tremor in her hands had disappeared. In the rearview mirror, Denver shrunk to nothing, just buildings and traffic and the ordinary lives of ordinary people who would never know what it cost to choose courage. "Power is not a title," Brooke said quietly, more to herself than Marcus. "Power is the ability to help." He smiled. "Ramirez said that too." "I know," she said. "I taught it to him." They drove toward the airport as morning light broke across the highway behind them, and for the first time since she'd walked into St. Michael's, Captain Brooke Sullivan didn't have to hide who she was. If you've ever wondered what happens when the quiet person in the room finally gets recognized, if you've ever held back your own strength because the world wasn't ready to see it, I want to hear your story. Subscribe for more videos about the ones who change everything while the world isn't watching. Like this video if you believe in second chances. And comment below, what would you have done in Brooke's position?